Hello, and welcome to this video lecture called Ludology, Narratology, Simulation, and Story. It's a lecture by me, Professor Matthew Sage. I work in the Communication, Media, and Theater Department at Northeastern Illinois University. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about how video games are different from classical literature because they require simulation and interaction. And that's why we're going to cover terms like ludology and narratology, which we'll get to shortly. Before we get to that, I have a brief disclaimer. You might remember this disclaimer from the last lecture too, but let's get to it. Okay, remember, video game studies is nascent. It's brand new. We're writing these rules as we go as far as studying them academically. That means you're learning and I'm learning what it means to study video games academically every day. So, because it's nascent, let's cover some of these new terms and talk about how they do and don't apply to video games in classical literature and academic studies. Cool? Cool. Okay, so let's talk about this term ludology. A lot of the definition for this term that I'll give you this semester comes from a reading written by Gonzalo Frasca called Simulation versus Narrative, Introduction to Ludology. I'll give you a full citation for that at the end of this video. But for now, let's start with the basics. Ludology is a term which has a Latin root, which is ludos, which is to play. So it's the study of games. Ludology existed before video game studies. You could say that studying how chess works or how checkers works or Go Fish, that's the study of games too. With ludology, it's less a study of the story of a game and more about the gameplay itself and how players interact with the game. It's really interested in that interactive quality. Okay, so now that we have a foundational definition of ludology, let's talk a little bit more about its complexity. From a ludological approach, when you're studying video games, that's where the rules are the thing you're studying the most. The narrative is simply like an imaginary layer cast on top of those rules. So ludology is really interested in the rules, and those rules are a lot of things, whether it's how players move in the simulated world, the point systems and the scoring, even things as complex as like gravity or physics. These qualities can be categorized into three broad dimensions. The first is mechanics, and that's the information that constructs the world of the game. Those algorithms that control play. So in a board game, it might be dice or, drawing cards that let you move. For dynamics, that's how the game plays. Those are events, both predictable and surprising. A game can't exist without human interaction, and so that's where dynamics comes in. It's the human interaction with an algorithmic set of rules. Last is the aesthetics. That's the emotional responses evoked during interactions. It's how a game feels to you as a player, to other players who are interacting with the game at the same time as you. The aesthetics is like the really human component of everything. Okay, so let's zoom out again. Ludology is an exploration of how games are simulations and how those simulations operate outside of reality and how players interact with those rules to create play. Game builders create worlds using both rules and narrative, and those worlds function as simulations. Even simple games like checkers are simulations. Think about it this way. You just have some red and black pieces on a checkerboard, but if you bring one of your pieces all the way to the opposite side of the board, you get kinged. You're simulating a sort of medieval castle battle game. Even though it's really fundamental and simple, there's still simulation even in a game like checkers. So, ludological studies is interested in how those rules facilitate simulation and how simulation facilitates play. It's way less interested in how stories are being told, and instead, it's more interested in how simulations create interactions. Does that make sense? To be a little bit more clear, maybe we could talk about the opposite of what ludological studies would be, which is narratology, or narrative studies. Video game theorists kind of land in one of these two camps. And so with ludology, any sort of narrative that is any quality or story can be applied to any set of rules to create a game. Ludology is interested in people and the rules of a game. Narrative studies is focused less on the rules and more on the quality of the story and how people read the story. Take Monopoly, for example. Monopoly is built on one sort of fundamental set of rules, do not pass go, blah, 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 roll your pieces, get a chance card, go to jail. The other thing is there are hundreds of kinds of Monopoly games. You can sort of change the skin on Monopoly and it changes the story. Whether you're a real estate magnate in, turn of the century New York City in classic Monopoly, or you're buying the Death Star in Star Wars Monopoly. There's all sorts of different kinds of Monopoly. Even though the rules stay the same, the narrative is flexible and can be cast on top of it. In the reading, Gonzalo Frasca makes a really interesting case where he talks about Quake and how by changing the skins on Quake, it could suddenly become a game about killing terrorists instead of aliens. So this is where that disclaimer from the beginning of the video comes in. There's no really right or wrong way to talk about video games, whether it's from a ludological perspective or a narratological perspective. Ludologists have questions about narratology in video games though, and I think that those questions are valid, so we should talk about them. Games are full of indeterminacy. Things can go wrong in video games. No one can ever play the same game of Tetris twice. So how can one judge a game accurately when there are so many possible outcomes? And some games lack narrative completely. Again, think Tetris. There's not really a story to Tetris. You're just stacking blocks. The story is how you as a player interact and handle with the random shapes being thrown at you. So ludologists believe that games, though colored by narrative, are best categorized as simulations, whereas we've been reading video games for a long time in the same way that people read literature. And when I say read, I mean critically study. You can't really critically study video games the same way you critically study Shakespeare, because Shakespeare's works are fixed. They don't change. Video games change all the time, every time someone plays them. And so that's why this sort of shift between narrative studies, which is kind of old school, and ludological studies, which is a bit more new school, is important to think about. The difference between story and simulation. Okay, so let's talk about this term simulation. Again, Gonzalo Frasca, in his paper Simulation versus Narrative Introduction to Ludology, published in 2003, says all games, but video games especially, are simulations. He defines it further. Quote, simulations are laboratories for experimentation where user action is not only allowed, but also required. He goes on to say that authors who write classical narratives have executive power. The reader has no real agency in how the story plays out. Think about it that way. You could read the same Shakespearean play hundreds of times, and no matter what you do, the words are going to stay the same. But game builders, or these quote-unquote sim authors, don't tell stories as much as craft laws, and then invite players to interact with those laws to create their own simulated events. It's far different from writing a story. You give the players a sort of outline for a world, and then they get to interact in that world to create a story. So Frasca and other ludologists herald this simulation and game system as a subversion of ancient narrative structures because players are given agency in a simulation. In the literature of the past, readers were subject to the author's will entirely. And who historically were the authors of great literature? That's right, it's generally white guys with expensive educations. And so the reading public was limited to the agency of those writers in these constrictive narratives that didn't change. In simulations or games, players are liberated and they're activated by the rules that they're provided, and they can thus create their own narratives. This is totally radical and exciting to give the audience, the public, a sort of agency over a shared communal narrative space. Okay, so it might seem like I'm talking a lot of smack about narratology, but let me be clear first of all and say I have a degree in literature and creative writing, so I care about narrative. And I haven't been spending a lot of time talking about narratology and narrative because we've already learned a lot of this stuff in previous classes in our lives. We've been taught the basics of narratology since we were very young, from storybooks and novels as well as film and television. We all know Freytag's pyramid. We all know the sort of basic three-act structure of a story. But it's important to remember narrative is how we learn information. Narrative is how we engage with our shared communal cultures, and narrative is how we establish our identities. We tell ourselves stories all the time so we remind ourselves who we are. We use our imaginations to produce narratives, but narrative is distinct from simulation because the events of a narrative are fixed. No matter how many times one watches a film or reads a book, the events in that narrative will never change. Even if George Lucas goes and refigures some special effects in Star Wars, the story is basically the exact same no matter what. Narrative doesn't really change. Simulation does. But narrative is an essential part of simulation. Without narrative, a game would just be rules. Without narrative, you'd never be kinged in checkers. You would just get this extra piece on top. We as human beings, we desire characters and places. We desire this thing called quiddity, which is like the substance of a story. We desire quiddity from our simulations as much as from our fixed stories. So how a narrative is draped onto a set of rules adds to the qualities of immersion and pleasure and emotional investment that players have with simulations. You could have a game with the exact same set of rules and have one narrative that's really compelling and engaging and one that's less developed, and players would like the game less because the narrative isn't as rich, even though the rules are the exact same. So narrative is important. It's an important part of Ludology. As Ludology is interested in categorizing playership, like we talked about earlier, narrative seeks to categorize and detail qualities of storytelling. This includes all that classical literary terminology you've learned in your English classes, including many other things, but definitely like archetypes, these perpetual character types that we know, like an underdog or a hero or a villain or etc. There's also story structures like the 3-act structure, plot basics, even things like twists and cliffhangers. Those are part of the story structures that go into narratology. Then there's metatext and references. This is references to other texts, other stories, other myths and legends that lend moral and cultural qualities to stories. There's also the idea of like a reliable or unreliable narrator. Whether or not your narrator is trustworthy or telling the reader the truth, that's important when you're reading a story. It's also important when you're playing a game. All the other narrative qualities you've learned studying stories your whole life are part of narratology too. So, as we study and explore games this semester, we will be exploring how the games we play invite us to become a part of their rules and also to create their stories. By interacting with simulations, we become agents of play, but we also become narrative entities. Both ludology and narratology are important because without rules, games are just stories. Go read a book. And without stories, games are just rules, and a game that's just rules doesn't really sound very fun to me, so I don't know, maybe let's add some story to these rules. See what I'm saying? Okay, so here's a few closing notes. Again, video game studies is both ludological and narratological. We can also study how games connect in vivo, that's like in real life. In more ways than just the classic video games cause violence read, the games we play and how and why we play them says a lot about our collective and individual cultures. This cultural studies approach to games seeks to treat video games as any other media object, a film, a book, a song, etc., and explore through critical and analytical approaches how and what games mean to cultural moments. We're going to talk a lot about Stuart Hall in a few weeks, and he is a sort of leading theorist about cultural studies and how popular culture says a lot about broad human culture. It's really interesting stuff. So, thanks for tuning into this video lecture about ludology, narratology, simulation, and story. This video lecture contains original music made by me, Matthew Sage. A lot of the information that appeared to you in this lecture came from a reading called Simulation versus Narrative, Introduction to Ludology, written by Gonzalo Frasca for Video Game Theory, edited by Mark J.P. Wolf and Bernard Perrin. It came out on Routledge Press in 2003. There's also a lot of reference to the book called Understanding Video Games, The Essential Introduction, 4th edition, written by Simon Ingfeldt Nielsen, Jonas Hyde Smith, and Susan Pajeras Tosca. Both of these books are referenced on your syllabus. You should check them out.